Welcome to the CharityVillage Connects podcast. A recent TELUS Health Mental Health Index indicates that employees experiencing workplace conflict lose up to 55 days in productivity per year. The impacts of conflict at work are clear: lost productivity, but also stress and diminished mental health for the staff who experience it. In this episode, we explore the contributing factors, including power dynamics, racism and microaggressions, and mounting workloads. We'll outline an organization's legal requirements to take action and leave you with some practical tips to address workplace conflict. Please welcome Donna Marshall, CEO of Workright. Donna is a registered psychotherapist, thought leader, public speaker, lecturer, curriculum developer, and writer specializing in mental health. Welcome to the podcast, Donna.
Nice to be here, Mary.
We're talking today about workplace conflict and specifically how this shows up in its most extreme forms. Many of us have experienced some interpersonal conflict in our professional lives, but at what point does it cross the line into bullying or harassment? And what are the key signs that people should be watching out for?
I would say a real line in the sand is respect. And we can ask ourselves, either for ourselves or for the people who are communicating with, are you treating people and speaking to them in a respectful way? And vice versa, are they treating me and speaking to me in a respectful way? So there's actually two ways that harassment shows itself in the workplace. One is overt, which is obviously that we can see it, we can hear it, it's very obvious to ourselves, and if it happens in front of others, they're very aware of it as well. So examples of this would be yelling, swearing, ridiculing, offensive, derogatory, sexually explicit communication, unwanted, unnecessary touching, and threats. Now, most of us moved into a hybrid work environment now. These things can happen online just as much as they can happen in person. The other piece is the covert, which is hidden. And that's really harder to see and also to prove. So some of these examples might be deliberately withholding information from people who need that information to do their jobs, or leaving them out of the information loop. And I'm a psychotherapist, as you mentioned, in private practice as well. And a lot of our clients are experiencing workplace bullying and harassment. And they are deliberately left out. I've seen senior people. One example comes to my mind of a senior person who got a new boss, and this person started keeping information from her, leaving her out of meetings, and then doing the covert thing like, oh, I forgot. Well, you don't really need to be there. And it became so bad for her that she had to take time off for stress leave, quite a bit of time. And she's an extremely high functioning individual. And it turned out that the new boss had somebody they wanted to put in her place and were setting her up for failure, and doing a good job of it, might I say. Sabotaging someone's success, there's an example of that. Scapegoating, destructive gossip behind people's backs, taking credit for their work. I think maybe all of us have experienced that. And another would be extreme micromanaging. So some people are kind of controlling managers, which isn't uncommon in a leadership situation. The line is crossed when we're always deeply scrutinizing people's work. I had someone disclose to me that she had her boss move over and sit beside her in the next little cubicle, and kept looking over and asking her questions all the time. And you can only imagine the impact of this is you lose confidence, you're afraid, and you end up actually making more mistakes than you wouldn't if you weren't being scrutinized.
So certainly acts of sabotage and kind of undermining the person's confidence, and in this sort of subtle manipulative way of being I guess impacting how they might actually perform, and thereby undermining the work that they're doing.
That's right. It actually leads to people taking time off for stress leave, and then they aren't able to function in the workplace. It's moved along, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy on the part of the individual who's doing the bullying and harassment.
Well, sometimes the nonprofit sector has a reputation for being overly nice or caring. And there's a sense that this kind of behavior might be a lesser problem for nonprofit organizations than in the for-profit world, for example. How big of an issue is this in our sector? Are there differences in how it shows up here as opposed to, for example, a corporate office?
That's a really good question. So actually, we go back to the overt and covert. So in not-for-profits, we are overtly nice and kind. And the bullying and harassment take place at a very covert level. And it's called passive-aggressive harassment or bullying, which is probably the hardest to deal with. So being nice and caring isn't the problem. It's how nice people deal with conflict. And passive aggressiveness, there was research done and published in Harvard Business Review a few years ago, and they surveyed not-for-profits in North America and found that passive aggressiveness is the biggest way of leading and managing conflict in not-for-profits. So this is something, and this is because nice people have a hard time with conflict. Nice people are drawn to be involved in not-for-profit work because we want to change the world. We're kind people, but then we're also afraid of conflict. And so it's really hard, or comes, I guess, to our own development as leaders and as individuals, that we work on this part of ourselves. And a big piece of this is training on how to learn some assertiveness skills. So not aggressive skills, assertiveness, communication skills, in order to be able to handle these conflicts and not let it spill over into harassment. I actually had an example of that. I was doing a training at a very large not-for-profit a number of years ago, and I had the leaders of all the departments in the training. And we were talking about harassment and these kinds of things and the legislation around it and against it. And one leader, a manager, said to me, said to the whole group, he said, "So I've got this employee I really don't like, so I can't just make this employee's job so difficult that they'll quit." And I thought he was being sarcastic and trying to be funny. And he wasn't. He was literally setting up an employee to be fired. And so this isn't not only cruel, but it's also against the law. There's a really good saying I like that when you're kind to the cruel, you're cruel to the kind. So I think we have to be very careful and look at ourselves in how we manage these situations. And just as an aside, we're partnering with CharityVillage in a soft skills certificate program. And this program covers the kinds of skills that you need to be able to deal with these issues in a direct but kind way.
Thank you for mentioning that. In your experience, where does this behavior typically play out? Is it between managers and employees, or between clients and staff, or are there other common relationship dynamics at play? You shared some examples. Could you just fill us in on where you typically see this kind of dynamic happen?
Well, statistically, 85% of the cases where harassment and bullying take place, the person is senior to the person they're harassing. So that means people with power and influence are generally those who abuse people junior to them. And when I say influence, in not-for-profits, board members not infrequently bully and harass people either on their board or leaders within the organization. And this gets even trickier to deal with because these board members have influence. So it typically occurs in that way and is very hard on people because there is no avenue, and I'm going to come back to that. That's a caveat, for more junior people, and that could be even an executive director in relation to a board, being able to address these issues. Now, there are also that 15% that occurs in non-power related relationships. So that could be clients, that could be donors, that could be coworkers. I had an example of a young woman who was going offside to meet with a donor organization, and she was alone in a room, and one of the senior people in that organization came over, stood behind her, and started rubbing her neck and her shoulders and said, you know, we're going to just get along fine as long as you're the one who's going to be working with me on this project. Fortunately for the organization, they took that very seriously. They had taken harassment management training. They had implemented very strong policies, and they dealt with that client directly.
Well, what kinds of impacts are felt by individuals who are experiencing this kind of behavior at work? How do they experience it personally? And then maybe you could also address the wider impact on the organization itself.
Sure. So it's really interesting, and we need to get our heads around this reality that workplace mental health issues are the biggest contributors to workplace mental health issues are bullying and harassment, the biggest. So what organizations need to do is to be very clear on creating a culture of psychological safety. And again, the way that we do that, again, we're partnering with CharityVillage on the mental health certificate program. And throughout that program, we actually provide the specific information. We have an assessment where you assess the culture of your organization for psychological and physical safety, and then give you a step-by-step program to implement within that. And within your organization. So I would say that needs to be, your culture really needs to be one that is safe. In order to be safe, you have to make a commitment to deal with bullying and harassing behavior directly, and do what is needed to be done. And all employees need to be trained on this and know this is the impact of what will be happening. And really all of the programs that we're doing with CharityVillage dovetail into each other, because taking the harassment, anti-harassment training, compliance training, we outline the requirements of how organizations can put their policies together and how they need and are required by legislation to implement them. Now, in terms of individuals, I've been doing this for many years, and they present with high levels of depression, anxiety, fear, like people are terrified to go into work. It's like Sunday afternoon and I'm already getting sick about having to go into work and face what this person's going to do to me. In very serious cases, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, has been diagnosed. This has to be diagnosed by a registered mental health professional. But PTSD is now not considered just a traumatic event that happens, although that, of course, is something that happens and is generally thought of as a physical trauma. But now we know that repeated acts of undermining, all the things I identified as harassing behaviors, do lead to a diagnosis of PTSD, which then goes to stress leave and insurance increases, insurance claims, and also liability. Of course, that the young woman I mentioned who was in the cubicle that her boss moved into, extreme lack of confidence. Same with the senior woman I mentioned. Very competent people, and suddenly they just had no confidence in their abilities. And again, that creates that spiral I mentioned, that then they lose confidence and then they make mistakes and then they aren't as competent. Certainly insomnia is a huge one. And also, I know a woman, high functioning, again, very successful, bullied and harassed by her bosses who were getting threatened by her success. and setting her up sexually, harassing her, everything. And it was so bad for her that she couldn't function within her family. So she said, I feel so angry and upset that I've lost the last 4 years of my life with my children and my husband and my family due to my extreme upset and PTSD as in relation to the harassment. So it's very, very damaging to people.
Well, you mentioned the legislation that covers harassment, bullying, and sexual violence. Can you describe it to our listeners about what's in place, for example, in Ontario, and what organizations um, should understand about what their responsibilities are?
That's a great question. So, yes, you're right. Each province in Ontario has workplace harassment requirements under their provincial legislation. The federal government also has federal harassment legislation, which is only applicable to public service organizations. So, you need to know what your provincial legislation is. Um, Most of them are very similar. There's a few differences, but essentially they're all the same. Ontario is considered to have the highest level and standard of legislation around harassment in the workplace. So the bottom line in all of it is that it is against the law to harass people in the workplace. Now, the definitions of harassment, again, we give you in that training because it's actually broad. It says that it's vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace that is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome. Well, that's so broad. So generally, organizations put into their policies the actual behaviors that are considered to be harassing. Now, the problem is that business people are not psychologists. And so we know from a psychological perspective and from our work in health and safety what legitimate behavioral actions are that would constitute harassment in the workplace. And I identified some of them there, overt and covert. There's an exhaustive list in our program called the HEART program, but it needs to be outlined in your policy and in your plan. Now, in Ontario, and my business partner, Dr. Bott, and I actually informed the legislation on Bill 132. We found that just because there are policies in place doesn't mean they're implemented. Like in Bill 168, the only thing that was required, and that was on harassment legislation back in 2005, the only thing that was required was that you have a policy and you post it for everyone to see. And that clearly was not enough. And so we recommended to the Ministry of Labour in Ontario that they also add a plan to implement the policies must be included, and all employees need to know what that plan is, and all leaders need to be trained on how to respond to incidents or reports of violence and harassment in the workplace. So our compliance training that we're doing with CharityVillage does outline that, and it's really important that leaders take that, owners of small companies or EDs of or HR in charitable organizations have that plan in place and be prepared to implement it.
Right. Policies are only as good as they are enforced. So certainly critical element that needed to be adapted into that legislation. What are some of the risks to organizations who ignore workplace conflict when it's happening? What might they be looking at in terms of liability?
There is more and more opportunities, not just for liability, because that can be expensive, and sometimes organizations bank on people not having the money to do this. But we all know social media can devastate your organization. And a few years ago, the president and CEO of one of the biggest banks in the country had someone out him on harassment that was taking place in the organization. And that led to significant fallout and significant changes in the policies and how people were treated, rules of conduct and plans to ensure that this didn't happen in the workplace. So I think we have to be aware of both of those. So in terms of litigation, if you have implemented as an employer the programs, the plans, and all the other requirements of the legislation, again, those are covered off in the HEART program, which we offer with Charity Village, then you're going to be fine. We've had not-for-profits come to us and say when we had litigation against us from an employee around these issues, and the lawyer on the other side said, "You've been so thorough, there just isn't a case." So it's always good to be proactive, and much easier and much less stressful. Other issues that happen, risks in an organization, is retention. We know now, and Charity Village does cover a lot of information on employment and retention and these kinds of important issues, that people are looking for a psychologically safe workplace culture, and that's really important to them. And so we're going to lose good, talented people if we aren't managing this. And the other piece of it is we end up keeping the bullies and harassers. And then that just creates a more insidious and negative and toxic work culture. So we really need to nip these things in the bud. Mental injury claims. So the WSIB in Ontario now will take, again, Dr. Bott and I influenced the also getting mental injury as something that can be claimed. Prior to that, which is maybe 5 years ago now, only physical injuries were compensated by WSIB. Now mental injuries are claimed by WSIB, and workplace bullying and harassment is the biggest one, the biggest contributor, and with diagnoses of severe depression, anxiety, PTSD. So there's that. Your insurance claims can go up. Your insurance costs can go up. Then again, people can just take stress leave. They literally can't cope. And many of the people who are in my practice in these situations are very high functioning, successful people, and they are on stress leave. And the organization is losing their capabilities, as well as putting more pressure on other staff to have to pick up the weight of that. So again, there are so many losses. There's really no reason not to be dealing with these issues.
And how does the legislation protect volunteers? As you know, a lot of organizations function by having a lot of volunteers in the community supporting their mission. What should organizations be aware of when it comes to ensuring the safety of their volunteers?
That's really important to think about, Mary. They are not, an organization, a not-for-profit, is not required to train their volunteers because it's literally about the rights of workers. That said, I don't think they were considering volunteers when they wrote the legislation, because volunteers are valuable, valuable people who we want to feel safe and good about their contributions. And so I always recommend that you get your volunteers, that you include volunteers in the training, and that you make sure that your leaders and other individuals are trained to include volunteers and contractors in their implementation of these policies. And again, we do talk about that in the Charity Village compliance training.
Yeah, it seems to me that as you're aware, there's so many organizations that wouldn't even exist were it not for the efforts of their volunteers, and it's kind of quite tragic to think that they aren't protected by the legislation that would apply to actual employees. What final thoughts would you like to leave our audience with today? It's been such a fascinating and distressing, in fact, discussion. What is there anything you'd like to leave for our audience to know as we wrap things up here?
I guess just to reiterate that harassment does incredible damages to both individuals and to organizations. And it's a number one priority in terms of the success of your organization. And it doesn't have to be overwhelming. So, I want to go back to a couple of things. Training your staff, especially those who are aggressive or even passive or passive aggressive, actually, in soft skills, and learning how to manage difficult people, manage situations, manage our own emotions in relation to these situations, because we're all under stress. We're all dealing with a lot of things. And sometimes we can say and do things that we feel badly about and don't intend to, and then it can create a problem. So having that training can really help. So the soft skills is crucial. Absolutely, the compliance training is regulated and mandated, and you need to be up to date on that without question. And then the other thing is the mental health certificate program. So we've created a really good bundle of programs that can give the not-for-profit everything that you need in order to implement these things, because it can feel overwhelming. And your managers, and you work in a not-for-profit, you aren't mental health professionals, you're not lawyers. So we've taken this all down and put it together in a really palatable way to be able to implement and access in also a very cost-effective way. So it's really about how are you going to identify, manage, and respond to incidents of bullying and harassment in your workplace. And I would say that is the crucial thing, because then that is going to reduce your incidence of mental health issues in the workplace.
Well, Donna, your insights into this really important issue impacting so many workplaces, including in the nonprofit sector, is so greatly appreciated. It's been fascinating and, as I mentioned, somewhat distressing, but it's important that we take on this information so we can do a better job of keeping our employees psychologically safe and healthy, so that our organizations can continue to deliver on their missions. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
Thank you, Mary.